Shabbat Shalom. This is Shabbat Terumah, and our Parsha, Terumah, means a lifted offering to God, which is also one of the shofar calls that we use quite regularly. This Parsha begins with God's instructions to Moshe as to how the Mishkan, the movable sanctuary, is to be constructed. The central theme underlying this parsha is found at the very beginning in chapter 25. We see God saying to Moshe, "Let them make me a sanctuary, a holy place, that I may dwell among them." The Hebrew word for "I will dwell" is vishakanti. The root of this word is shin kaf nun, the same as for the word mishkan, used in the Torah for God's wilderness sanctuary. And so we see that the key to understanding the importance of the Mishkan, about which so much is written in the Torah, is really in its name. The Mishkan was to be built in order to establish Hashem's dwelling among his people. This was God's idea, not something that we thought up. God is Ruach. We're told that throughout the scriptures, and we know that he is everywhere. Yet he chose a particular space in which to dwell with his people Israel. Interestingly, the verb shkanin, as in Mishkan, connotes a temporary, nomadic dwelling, not a permanent home. If God ceased to dwell there, it was a sign for us, a sign that it was time to pack up the structure, made to be portable, and the entire camp, and to begin traveling again. Another key word in this verse is botkam, translated as among them. But it can also mean within them. The word does not translate as among the nation as a whole, but rather within each one of them. We see then that the Mishkan is meant to represent to us God's desire to be present both among us as a community and within each one of us personally. The backstory for the Mishkan can be found in Egypt. We will recall Moshe standing before Pharaoh and giving him this message from God: "Let my people go, that they may serve me." God wanted his people to leave Egypt, but for a purpose. The goal was not freedom in itself. It was the opportunity to serve God. Clearly, we could not serve our God in Egypt as slaves. In Devarim we read, "And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might," or all your strength. We recite the Vahavta weekly together, and twice daily on our own, morning and evening. As we noted from our readings last week, this was called by Rav Yeshua the greatest commandment. When we put these two concepts together, we understand that to love God is to serve him, and to serve him is to love him. The verse from Devarim chapter 6, verse 5 teaches us a valuable lesson that God has given us the ability to know, to serve, and to love Him. We do this using our emotions, our minds, and our wills to act, as well as we use whatever we possess in terms of gifts and abilities. And this also has to do with action. Beginning with Parashah Yitro, where the 10 words are given, we see God presenting this threefold approach to His people. In Parashah Yitro, we view the deeply moving, emotional scene at Sinai, following the incredible deliverance from Egypt, where our people, for the first time, meet with God. And they responded, "All that Adonai has spoken, we will do." God directed Moshe to embark on the ultimate building enterprise, according to the design and specifications that he provided, similar in a way to the way he directed Noah to build the ark. Moshe, who had most recently been a shepherd, was to direct construction of a structure and objects which had never been seen before, including the Ark of the Covenant, which would hold the tablets containing the Torah given by God on Mount Sinai. And there was to be an ornate 7-branch golden menorah made of pure gold, a golden altar, and an altar of incense, along with a myriad of other objects and tools, never made before, never used before. And let us not forget the complex Mishkan itself, which our people were to use as dedicated holy space to make daily sacrifices and to commune with God for the next 40 plus years. Well, of course, it turned out to be considerably more than that. For people recently freed from more than 400 years of slavery, this was an ambitious project, to say the least. What made the task even more challenging was that God stated that its construction would be based specifically in significant quantities of gold, silver, copper, blue, purple, and crimson wool, linen, goat's hair, ram skins, and acacia wood. And he told them exactly how these were to be used. And only the finest craftspeople could create this holy space. Where would we find these things and these people? God expected that all of the items and skills would be donated by every person whose heart inspires him or her to generosity. What if we were not interested in gifting our limited resources and talents for this project? Wasn't God asking quite a lot of those who had little and who were still trying to grasp his mishpatim and his authority and their freedom as well? how would Moshe proceed if the people were reluctant to give? But of course, God had already and quite recently provided the materials necessary for this project. God had seen to it that the Egyptians wanted us gone so badly that they practically paid us to leave Egypt. It was by God's provision that we, who as slaves had really nothing, left Egypt with great wealth in gold, silver, copper, fine cloth, even herds of cattle and flocks of sheep and goats. We are told that the giving continued even as the work began, until the workmen said that we had brought more than enough to complete the project. What a testimonial this is to the hearts of our people who gave willingly and abundantly of what God had given them. And where did the skilled craftspeople come from? Obviously, God had provided these skills, which were no doubt honed while working on the elaborate artifacts of the tombs of Egypt. According to Jewish tradition, although gold and copper and the other materials were given in this way, each Bnei Israel was asked to bring a half shekel of silver. In this way, it is said, each of our people, from the greatest to the least, gave equally to the building of the Mishkan. Each one was investing in the process of creating the framework for God's presence to dwell among us. Each Israelite probably knew that there were those who had more material resources to give for this important project. What could have been seen as an ambitious and exclusionary project that asked for sizable donations from a few people became an enterprise that built consensus and unity. By opting in to the building process, each person gained ownership of the future promised by God and received the privilege of saying that he or she contributed to the building of the Mishkan. There are a number of lessons that we can learn from this parasha. Poet Walt Whitman wrote, "The habit of giving only enhances the desire to give. That is, the more you give, the more you want to give." Parashat Terumah introduces the building of the Mishkan as an opportunity to honor God and to give thanks for the blessing of freedom, survival, and chosenness. But to be able to begin this process, each child of Israel, those by birth and those by choice like Kalev, had to opt in to this notion of giving, a very new concept for former slaves. They had to understand that their gifts, no matter how large or how small, were welcome and equal in God's eyes, contributing to their future and that of their children. In Egypt, Pharaoh had owned everything. No one had really had the opportunity to contribute. But here, things were so different. Now we move forward in time, about 400 years, to our Haftorah portion, reading of the construction of the first Mikdash in Jerusalem exactly 460 years later. This is the house that Shlomo built. In the case of both the Mishkan and the Mikdash, it is by God's command that the sacred space is created. He provides exacting details as to how these sacred places should be built and how they should look. In neither case does God provide for the cost of the construction, nor does he directly provide the material with which it is to be built. These details are left to us, God's people. We are given the opportunity to be participants in the creation of a dwelling for God. For the Mishkan, Moshe held a fundraiser. Everyone was encouraged to give and to give as much as possible. The emphasis was on full participation above and beyond the regular tithes and offerings, giving already commanded by God. Our people as a whole volunteered their possessions and their services to build the Mishkan. They gave all the materials needed without a murmur or a complaint. This from people who were so often given to murmuring and complaining. No one kept anything back, anything that was needed, and no one suggested that what was being asked was too much, too great a sacrifice, too OTT. And they gave only the best of everything. The people also gave their energy, their time, and their skills. All those with fabric working ability, able to embroider, both men and women, able to cut fabric, sew fabric, offered their services to God. Skilled metal workers offered themselves for service to God. Those who could do neither of these things, but were willing to do whatever was needed, some of it just plain hard work, they too came forward to offer themselves in whatever way they were required. From among each group, Moshe chose those who should be in charge, people who could organize, who could keep track of the materials, and who would encourage progress in the work. All of those who worked to make the Mishkan did only their best work, gave only the best of themselves to serve God's purposes. God enunciated the ideal at the outset. Tell the Bnei Israel to bring me gifts. You shall accept gifts from me, from every person whose heart moves him. Bring me gifts. If they'd failed to contribute, they would be refusing God's request, and of course, the project would have been delayed, if not aborted. The narrative stresses the extraordinary degree of their compliance. The occasion stirred all to share equally and unstintingly of their valuables and handiwork for the house to be built for God's glory. For the great Mikdash in Jerusalem, King David tried to prepare the way by providing many of the materials that were needed. He encouraged others to contribute in advance, as we read in the first book of Chronicles, chapter 29, beginning with tribal princes and captains of thousands and hundreds. Those who could give, gave gold and silver, precious stones, brass, iron, and other materials. And it says, then the people rejoiced because they offered willingly, because with a perfect heart they offered willingly to the Lord. And David the king rejoiced also. This was the example of David. But in spite of this example, Shlomo gave no opportunity for volunteerism in the financing or building of the house for God. To pay for cedar and cypress wood and to quarry and transport the building materials, Shlomo taxed and imposed forced labor on Israel. 30,000 men were forced into labor and sent to Lebanon in shifts of 10,000 per month. Shlomo also had 70,000 porters and 80,000 quarriers, apart from 3,300 officials who were in charge of the work. The contrast is striking, and the historical ramifications equally so. A medieval midrash observes, the tabernacle for which the people volunteered wholeheartedly never fell victim to evil. The temple, however, for which they did not, fell victim to the hand of the enemy. The Mikdash was never fully supported by our people, who at no time had the opportunity to invest themselves in this house built for God. It was thereafter known as Solomon's Temple. Is it any wonder that immediately after Shlomo's death, the kingdom split and true worship of God was carried on only by a minority? Consider the purpose of this holy space. The Mishkan was an empty space awaiting God's presence. In a contradiction only possible for God himself is the concept that God is everywhere and yet can dwell within a specific space. The image of the empty space within and God waiting outside to be welcomed in is echoed in much of the language of the Shir HaShirim, where the lover, God, is portrayed as waiting outside the door for the beloved Israel to open it. There's a paradox here, as the very absence of God fuels the longing for God, a longing which causes us to be truly awake and aware of God's presence. One commentator has written, to be awake, pulses beating, is to be aware of distance, difference, to yearn to open to God at the right moment. That is, God cannot be inside if he is not outside, if the heart cannot imagine its emptiness. The image of God waiting brings to mind the saying that God dwells where we let God in. Each of us is like a Mishkan or a Mikdash, a hollow, empty structure with the potential for housing the holiness of God. It is our responsibility to allow his holiness to fill this space. Only through acknowledging and being mindful of the emptiness within ourselves do we sense the presence of God outside of us. If we do not have this sense of God outside, we cannot experience God within. In Hittakalut, Yochanan writes, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and will dine with him, and he with me." As human beings, we cannot help but feel lonely, empty, isolated, and depressed at various times in our lives. But instead of focusing attention on the emptiness, giving up to the sorrow, the anxiety, the pain, or the fear, we must shift our attention. Using the paradigm I've just described, we can allow the feeling of emptiness to draw us to recognize the cause of these empty feelings. It is the warmth of God's presence around us that causes us to feel the coldness of the emptiness within. It is the absence of Hashem that creates our desire for His presence. Just as feeling physically cold is the impetus for us to turn up the central heating or wrap ourselves in blankets, so the experience of emptiness should be the impetus for us to turn to God and open the door to allow Him to enter. As we come to recognize the paradoxes and contradictions within us, we can acknowledge the cause of these things, these feelings of discomfort, pain, or suffering more readily. And then comes the opportunity to acknowledge the opposing feelings that exist outside of ourselves. As we grasp this principle, we not only provide ourselves with an opportunity to allow God's presence to enter our hearts and our lives, but we reject the hold which ego has over each one of us. Constant, single-minded focus on our internal struggles and emptiness is merely another form of egocentricity and self-centeredness. Focusing on feelings of insecurity or lack of self-esteem is also a form of egocentrism, which keeps us thinking about ourselves, preventing us from being mindful of God's presence. Such egocentrism breeds apathy and irresolution instead of spiritual passion, challenge, and fundamental change. As we invite God's presence to enter, sanctifying us as He takes His place within us, we discover the potential to move outside our egos and connect with others and the world around us. This does not mean that the pain, the sadness, or the difficulties in our lives miraculously disappear. The miracle occurs when we allow God to be the center of our lives. And then we begin to turn outward, connecting with one another so that we can offer support and strength as we face the difficulties in our lives that we all share. Contradictions and paradoxes in our lives should be the catalysts that lead us to true interaction with Hashem. Without Him, our internal mikdash, which is supposed to be dedicated to God, is simply an empty space with unfulfilled potential. To live one's life in that way is to waste what we have been given by God. It's the choice of a living death over living life, selfishness over connection, and emptiness over holiness. To live one's life that way is to turn God away. No matter that He has redeemed us and desires that we light the world around us, we waste the precious gift that He has given to each of us. And we may never know what it means to have the presence of God truly indwelling within. You need only open the door of your mikdash wide. Welcome Hashem to enter on this Shabbat, so that He might fill the empty space in your life with His joy and His peace. Shabbat Shalom.